Thanks, Dan, for joining me again. It's good to be at the roadshow another year again.
We're pushing the message of economic freedom, at least to anyone who's willing to listen.
Well, there are some people who should listen more. You just published a book, The Greatest Ponzi Scheme. What is it about?
It's basically about the fiscal crisis that we have not only in the United States, but in many countries around the world, all being driven by the same factors: aging populations, demographic change. We're having fewer children, which are future taxpayers, and we're all living longer, which is good as we get a little bit more gray hair. But the problem is with welfare states, that's a recipe for an ever-growing burden of government spending. And the United States, as well as most countries in Europe and many other places in the world, this combination of demographic change, along with misguided entitlement programs, it's setting the stage for a fiscal crisis. So what happened in Europe about 15 years ago, it's going to happen again. And it's going to happen, I think, sooner than people think.
Well, it's a constant crisis, isn't it? Because structural reforms that should have long been done have not been taken care of.
Well, I draw the distinction between, as you say, the constant crisis. That's just government being too big, taxes being too high, and as a result, growth being lower than it should be.
And spending is
And of course, the spending
increasing.
keeps growing and growing. But what I'm talking about is the other kind of crisis. That's one of the focuses of the book, is that you have eventually, when international investors don't trust that you can pay back your government bonds, then all of a sudden your interest rates spike up. It's Greece all over again in 2009, and that's the path that I'm afraid we're on. So whether we're focusing on that sort of that extended crisis of just slower growth, or that all of a sudden fiscal crisis of the bond vigilante, so to speak, I'm very worried about the future of the U.S., and I'm very worried about the future of many other countries in the world.
Well, we have just seen an example of those, that what can happen with the bond markets if certain external shocks come in. Could you just elaborate a little bit on that? How governments finance themselves and why bond markets matter? Well,
bond markets matter because, in effect, they're a thermometer that measures the level of trust that people and institutions have in their governments. Now, we're recording this in sort of early, mid-April of 2025, and we just, in the last couple of days, saw bond markets and financial markets in the U.S. gyrate wildly, mostly in the wrong direction, because Trump was proposing protectionism. Now, that's a reaction to the threat of a collapse of world trade, a repeat of Herbert Hoover's mistakes of the 1930s, which is different from the kind of fiscal crisis that I write about in the book, but both share the common characteristic that bad government policy can lead to some really adverse consequences.
Well, let's first go to the current bad policies that you describe in your book, and then let's take a step back to the Hoover and Roosevelt mistakes. But let's go first to the book. So what is the key message? What would you tell the audience why they should buy this book?
Well,
and why it is a must-read?
It's a must-read because it's basically the future economically of the U.S. and other countries in the world that have made this mistake of setting up welfare states that were based on a population pyramid. And a population pyramid, of course, is very few old people at the top of the pyramid, a big generation of workers to finance those old people, and then a huge generation of children that will be, of course, the future taxpayers. And because we are moving from a population pyramid to a population cylinder, welfare states are fundamentally unaffordable. We need sweeping, dramatic reform to control the burden of government spending, and that's just not happening.
And what kind of reforms would those be? Capital-based pension systems, one thing, working longer, reducing welfare states and handouts. So what would you suggest?
Well, in the United States, because every country is, of course, going to be different, although what you said about capital-based pensions, that's personal retirement accounts, that's going to be true in almost every country in the world, although I'm embarrassed to admit that Europe is ahead of the United States. Denmark, Netherlands, Switzerland, Iceland, there are many countries in Europe, Sweden, that already have fully or partly, Greece, by the way, is in that list. Many countries in Europe have taken very impressive steps on pension reform. In the U.S., what we really have a problem with is our government health programs, Medicare and Medicaid, and we need to reform them like Republicans were trying to do about 10 years ago when the Tea Party was in the ascendancy. And unfortunately, Trump's more of a big government populist, so I don't really have much reasons for optimism right now. But we have to reform the health entitlements and Social Security. We know how to do it, and in both cases, unfortunately, there's just not any political interest right now in doing it. And I'm afraid the political interest might not revive until we're actually in the crisis, at which point it's much harder.
Too late. And then it's too late.
Well, it's not too late, but it's just infinitely harder. You don't want the economic suffering that comes along with a fiscal crisis. It's, what's the old line? You want to fix the roof when the sun is shining. And now it's not like we have bright sunshine now. The economies of the world aren't doing that great, especially with protectionism threatening global commerce. But certainly addressing these fiscal problems today would be a lot better than waiting until all of a sudden interest rates are spiking up to 10% and investors are in effect fleeing government bonds because they don't trust governments anymore.
So all that is covered in your book.
All that's covered in the book. Not only do we go through the theory, not only do we go through the U.S. evidence, but we also go through the evidence of what's happening in other countries. And I think probably the two most fascinating chapters, we have one chapter showing how countries get into trouble, and it's always overspending over an extended period of time. And we also have sort of the good stories, because there are examples of countries that have gotten their fiscal house in order. And we have a whole chapter with concrete examples of countries that used long-run spending restraint to fix the fiscal messes that they were in. So it's not all doom and gloom. There is actually a recipe for avoiding a fiscal crisis. Just how do you convince politicians to do the right thing when they usually only think to the next election?
Well, that is good to know that the Great Ponzi Scheme describes all those good solutions and that there is finally hope. So let's go back to one step to Hoover and Roosevelt. What went wrong back then?
A lot of things went wrong, because not only did both Hoover and Roosevelt increase spending and increase taxes, and we also, of course, had terrible monetary policy, which probably deserves the lion's share of the blame for the Great Depression. But what we had specifically under Hoover that has a very unfortunate resemblance to today's events is we had the Smoot-Hawley tariff, a massive increase in trade taxes. And by the way, it was massive, but guess who proposed even higher taxes on trade? Donald Trump. So we saw in the 1930s how protectionism backfires, leads to more poverty, more suffering, more unemployment. Unfortunately, Donald Trump slept through his history class. Either that or he was not a very good student, because he wants to repeat that same mistake, and he's basing it on a fundamental misunderstanding. He thinks a trade deficit and a capital surplus are bad. Well, a trade deficit and a capital surplus are different sides of the same coin. Foreigners like investing money in the U.S. economy. That's a sign of strength. But if you want to invest in the U.S. economy as a foreigner, you first have to earn dollars by selling things to Americans. So there's nothing wrong with a trade deficit. For that matter, there's nothing wrong with a trade surplus. These are the results of voluntary transactions by people and businesses making each other better off. And we shouldn't have a bunch of idiot politicians, whether we're looking in America or elsewhere around the world where there's protectionism. We shouldn't have politicians saying, sorry, if you want to engage in voluntary exchange, we're going to interfere and prevent you from doing it.
And Dan, what about the explanation? Why did the president, we are now April 2025, why did the US president go for those high tariffs, and why did he use reciprocal means and measures? Is this correct, or does it help?
Trump has never liked trade, and he specifically has always viewed a trade deficit as a sign that you're somehow losing. Well, I have a trade deficit with my local supermarket. I always go up and buy food from them, and they never buy anything from me. Is that a bad thing?
Well, shouldn't they buy your books?
Well, they should buy my book, but I'm not expecting that a supermarket will have a great demand for my book. But the point is, I'm engaging in voluntary exchange. If I'm buying more from someone than they're buying from me, who cares? I'm better off, because otherwise I wouldn't engage in the transaction. But Trump, the one thing he's been consistent on, even back when he was an explicit left-wing Democrat in the 1980s, he's always been against trade. He's never understood why trade is good for America. And if you look at what he proposed, it was supposed to be based on reciprocity, or if countries put tariffs against American export will put tariffs against theirs. Well, but if you look at what he actually did, it has nothing to do with tariffs. 68 countries around the world are more open to trade and have lower trade barriers than the United States. Trump still put tariffs on them. He based it on whether or not there's a trade deficit with that country. And he even put trade taxes on countries where the U.S. has a trade surplus. He just doesn't like trade. If there was an economics 101 class, he'd be a failing student.
Well, but trade is actually exchange of goods and services, and that has elevated our lives and societies. We grow wealthy with that. Why would you be against that?
I did the numbers looking at the Economic Freedom of the World Index from the Fraser Institute. I compared the 10 most free trade countries in the world to the 10 most protectionist countries in the world, and what do you know? The most free trade countries in the world are 14 times richer in terms of per capita GDP than the protectionist countries. Now, obviously, fiscal policy matters, monetary policy matters, lots of things matter, but all the evidence, it's always been so abundantly clear that free trade leads to greater national prosperity. You can go all the way back to Adam Smith and the division of labor to understand why it's good to have lots and lots of trade. You don't want to be Robinson Crusoe on an island, making your own, straw hut and, gathering coconuts and gathering fish. You'll be very poor. You want there to be a burgeoning global economy where there's lots of trade and commerce between nations. Just like, by the way, it's good to have trade between Texas and Utah. It's good to have trade between Indiana and Florida. Trade, we understand instinctively that trade inside of our country is good, and it doesn't even matter. We don't even keep data. Who knows whether there's a trade deficit between Tennessee and Texas or anything like that. We know it doesn't matter. So why suddenly, just because there are cross-border commerce, why is trade suddenly a bad thing? Of course it's not. It's good for America. It's good for the rest of the world.
And what happens if you put tariffs on products? Will the quality increase or decrease? Will the amount of transactions grow? Or what is just the basic things?
Well, one of the great insights of Ronald Reagan is that the more you tax something, the less you get of it. Well, what is trade? It's commerce between someone and a consumer and a business. The more you tax that, the less you're going to get of it. Now, there are all sorts of negative consequences from the approach of economic theory. You're going to have more inefficiency. You're going to have higher prices. You're going to have less competition. Your economy is just not going to be as vibrant. It's not going to be as dynamic. You're going to have less growth.
Well, this is a negative outcome. Let's hope there will be a way out. What would be your suggestion as a way out? Zero tariffs?
I'm a big believer in having a global free trade arrangement especially among the free democratic nations of the world. We've been moving in that direction ever since World War II, and it's one of the reasons the world has become richer. And it's great to see some poor countries entering the world trading system and climbing out of poverty. This is good news. We don't want to help other countries with foreign aid because that's corrupting and just promotes bigger government. We want to help other countries grow with free trade, but it's not because we're being magnanimous. The free trade is also good for us. And one of the great things about the Free Market Roadshow is that we're bringing the message of all sorts of good economic reform, but especially this year, we're talking a lot about the benefits of free trade because we have to help educate people in the face of some real nonsense coming out of Washington, D.C.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. Stay tuned. We will talk about the roadshow and many other events, and of course, economics constantly.
Well, thank you, Barbara.
Thanks.